I considered rushing this video out yesterday, probably would have got more views that way, but let's call things what they are. The news of the Queen's death has had, frankly, more of an emotional impact on me than I imagined it might, and if I am in any doubt about my ability to get through a video without any mawkish displays of sentimentality, then I don't do the damn video. Actually, my original plan was to skip Wednesday, watch the Hunter Biden movie, and review it on Thursday, but yesterday morning's news pretty much blew that plan all to shit. It would seem rather silly doing a movie review about a stripper impregnating crackhead right now, but I'll still do it, maybe in a few days. Moreover, I've had a day now to absorb the reactions to this momentous news. It is not every day that the most famous and well-admired person in the world passes away, after all, and I have found them striking. If you're old enough to remember 25 years ago today, then you will know it would have been inconceivable back then to imagine a Buckingham Palace crowd full of people crying out, "God save the King," and 3 cheers for King Charles, and so on. But that is exactly what we saw today. It would have been similarly inconceivable to imagine the British tabloids who, back in the first week of September 1997, were excoriating the Queen for her supposed aloofness to the suffering of her people and all but demanding that her office be abolished, to be engaged in fawning tributes toward that same woman who was the target of all their slings and arrows back then. And I guess the stock response from them would be, "Bah, don't blame us, we're just trying to sell newspapers, mate." But that doesn't make it any less shameful. But it's that contrast, and it is a marked one, that has me missing Christopher Hitchens today and wondering how heartened he might be by all this. Because Hitchens was the only man in Britain, the only man of any public prominence at any rate, who was willing to come out and say in the first week of September 1997 that this was an embarrassing display on the part of the British people. And it was that. I think most people realize that now, whether or not they are willing to say it out loud. The public reaction to the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, whose name was never Princess Diana, by the way, was completely absurd. And it flew in the face of everything that is supposed to define the British character. The British people who basically slit the throat of their own empire, reduced themselves from a great power to a middling one, wrecked their economy, and sent many hundreds of thousands of young British men to an early grave in order to defeat German imperialism twice in the first half of the 20th century. After the fall of France, Britain could have made a deal with Hitler and kept their empire. That's what Hitler thought was going to happen. That is what much of Churchill's cabinet wanted to happen. But what did Churchill and the King say? They said, "Fuck that. No deals with the devil. We will look evil in its face, we will oppose it by force of arms, and we will not stop until the evil is defeated." The British people then spent the summer and fall of 1940 being bombed into oblivion each night by the Luftwaffe. And each morning they got up, swept aside the rubble, buried the bodies, and went right back to work. Not a tear or a quivering lip from anybody. Because we're British. This is what we do. We respond to adversity with stoicism and resolve and an unshakable moral courage. That is what makes us such a fearsome opponent to any potential invader or aggressor. So it struck a lot of people as quite shocking, Hitchens included, when the death of the ex-wife of the Prince of Wales caused such an unprecedented spasm of national blubbering from the last people in the world you would expect to act that way. So this feels something like a course correction, like a tacit admission that everyone is embarrassed by that display of 25 years ago. As well they should be, because it was embarrassing. Like there's a realization that the proper way to pay tribute to a woman who lived a life of dignity and grace is by also displaying those same traits that she so well exemplified. And perhaps even there has been a realization that we shouldn't be so quick to reject out of hand the ancient and the traditional and the dignified, as so many are so eager to do in the current day and age. Maybe it doesn't do anything to advance the human condition when we tear down statues and impugn the character of everybody who died before we were born. Now, I have far more to say on this topic than I could ever fit into one 20-minute video, and I'm sure I'm going to probably repeat a lot of things that I said in the Prince Philip obituary video last year, for which I do apologize in advance. So do not hit the music, Jim Eagle. We're doing a silent open tonight. We're going to display the royal standard in honor and remembrance of a great lady and a life well lived. From high atop the battlements of Bangkok on the Pacific, where the weather is perfectly normal today, 85 degrees with a driving rain. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Britain and all ships in the channel. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host, humble servant and inveterate monarchist. And I got more text messages yesterday between 9 o'clock and 1 o'clock than I did probably in the previous month, which I guess is the price one pays when others perceive one as an expert on British royalty. I am often asked why I know so much about that topic, and it seems to me that the answer should be self-evident. Because you can't really be a student of history without knowing a lot of stuff about kings and queens and dukes and earls and so forth. But having said that, I don't feel like my knowledge is so voluminous that I should be having to correct the resident royal family expert on ITV, a British television network. But that happened quite a lot yesterday. I forget the guy's name, but he was just falling to pieces. He couldn't bring himself to say the words, His Majesty the King. No matter how many times he tried, he kept saying, His Majesty the Queen, over and over again, to the point where the anchor woman kept having to jump in and correct him. And then he said something I found rather unconscionable, when he referred to Cornwall as a dukedom. Cornwall is not a dukedom. Cornwall is a duchy. A dukedom is just a title. A duchy, like the Duchy of Cornwall, has lands and holdings that are attached to it. A royalty expert, speaking on national television on the day the monarch dies, shouldn't be making dumbass mistakes like that. And if you want to call me pedantic, I shall wear that label as a badge of honor, so thank you very much. But even at its worst, the British coverage is nowhere near as cringe-inducingly awful as the American coverage is. Our fake news media don't do many things well, except for telling bald-faced lies and openly shilling for Democrats. But they are always at the apex of their uselessness when covering stories on British royalty, because they all act like 5-year-olds who need the basics of the entire thing explained over to them, wondering out loud what the difference is between a queen regnant and a queen consort. Seriously? Because, spoiler alert, one is the monarch and one is not. God bless journalism. And it gets worse when they talk about the abdication. Though, to be fair, there has been much of that on both sides of the Atlantic these past 2 days. Here's the deal on the abdication. She still would have become the queen. It just would have happened 20 years later, is all. Take the abdication out of the equation, and what happens? Edward VIII ascends the throne in 1936, marries Mrs. Simpson in 1937, just as he did in real life, and they produce no issue. Both of them were over age 40, and according to rumor, she was infertile anyway due to a botched abortion. So Elizabeth's father dies in 1952, having never become George VI. And she duly becomes the heiress presumptive. Edward VIII dies in 1972, and Elizabeth ascends the throne at age 45 instead of age 25. So can we please all stop pretending that the abdication changed her ultimate destination? Because it very much did not. Granted, I am sure that she and the Duke of Edinburgh would have much preferred another couple of decades in which he could have kept pursuing his naval career, and she could have raised the kids and lived the life full of dogs and horses and country houses that she lamented not ever being able to live. But it just isn't correct to suggest that she became the monarch solely because of the abdication. So stop doing that. There are also a lot of really horrible people, leftists I believe they're called, who are using the occasion of the Queen's demise as an excuse to bitch and moan about the same dumb shit they always bitch and moan about. But I shall not give them the dignity of rebuttal, for they warrant no dignity of any sort. In fact, they harbor a reflexive, seething hatred to the whole concept of dignity. Anything ancient, anything traditional, anything apolitical, any person born before 1990. They want all of that swept away and forgotten about. It's why they enjoy pulling down statues so much. Why was Queen Elizabeth so well loved by her people? Well, there are a lot of good reasons for that, but here is the inarguable reason number one. Because we don't have the faintest idea what her political views were. In all the 70 years of her reign, there was only one little itty-bitty slip-up on her part when Scotland was doing their last independence referendum around 8 years ago. And as she was going into church on the day of the election, she was overheard whispering to someone that she hoped the referendum would fail. And that's it. There is nothing else. In 7 decades as the most famous person on the planet, with nearly her every word being recorded for posterity, that's the only time she ever expressed a political preference about anything. But the new king, he can never be loved in the same way, for we know altogether too much about his political views. We know that on most matters, he is a man of the left. We know he is a card-carrying greeniac climate cultist. We also know he passionately detests modern architecture, which is one area where I happen to agree with him rather enthusiastically. He started asking all the way back in the 80s, why can't we have nice-looking buildings anymore? Why does everything modern have to be so stupefyingly ugly? It's a hell of a good question, but one for which we still don't have a satisfactory answer. Granted, there is not any sort of protocol or constitutional convention that says all royal family members have to refrain from expressing their political views. That rule only applies to the sovereign. Like when Edward VII ascended the throne in 1901 after his mother had reigned for 63 years, his political views were widely known, as were his sexual proclivities, but he still wound up being a successful and well-liked monarch, to the point where they named the Edwardian age after him, even though he only reigned 10 years. And it would be exceedingly difficult in any day and age to live 60 or 70 years as a public figure and never let slip with any political opinions when you're not the monarch, and there is technically no rule that says you can't do that. But even still, if the views of the new King Charles were a mystery to everyone, then there would be a higher ceiling on his potential for gaining public affection as the king. Americans often have a very difficult time understanding what the point is of having a largely ceremonial monarchy with a politically impotent sovereign. I guess to some extent it is baked into the cake of our national character that we reflexively assume monarchy is 100% bad and stupid, titles of nobility are 100% bad and stupid, and furthermore, that we didn't lose anything when we eschewed those things when we were establishing our new nation. But is that true? I would submit that it is self-evidently untrue. We may have rejected having an official aristocracy and titles of nobility and all that, but what's been the result? The result has been that we just make up different kinds of aristocracy and nobility. We've made vapid, idiotic Hollywood celebrity douchebags into an aristocracy. We've made dull, unexceptional public health bureaucrats into an aristocracy. And worst of all, we've made our elected officials and their entire extended families sometimes into a de facto noble class in everything but name. In a country where hereditary political power is not supposed to be a thing, should there be a Kennedy family? Or a Bush family? Or a Cheney family? No, there should not, but there is anyway. And would we be any worse off, as a practical matter, if we just had an official hereditary noble titles and such? I can't see how. But there is one thing you get with constitutional monarchy, along the British lines, that you can't get anywhere else, and that is institutionalized dignity. One person whose purpose is to be the living embodiment of the nation and its history and its traditions, who stands outside and above politics, who serves as a living reminder that there is value, great value even, in the ancient and the traditional and the dignified. And that is the part of monarchy that Queen Elizabeth took most seriously and that she was best at, better than any British monarch ever has been or likely ever will be. That is why her people lament her passing, because the whole purpose of her office is to be a mirror in which her people can see the best part of themselves and the best aspects of their national character. It's going to seem unnatural now, both to the British people and everybody else, that a king now sits on the throne instead of a queen. In fact, it can be argued that the British monarchy is viewed as more of an innately feminine institution than a masculine one. And we have the late Queen and her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, to thank for that. For 133 of the last 185 years, or 72% of the time since 1837, the British sovereign has been a woman. And you know what else we haven't seen in a hell of a long time? A king not named George or Edward. You have to go back to 1837 for that as well, when Victoria succeeded her uncle William IV. They have had 4 kings since then: Edward VII, George V, Edward VIII, George VI. I had thought there was a decent chance of Prince Charles reigning as George VII, but Lady Curmudgeon, she brought up an outstanding point. When Prince William, the Prince of Wales as he is now, when he named his eldest son George, the writing was sort of on the wall that his grandfather was probably going to reign as Charles III and his father as William V. And when King Charles goes to St. James's Palace for the accession council tomorrow, he will be returning to the place where they cut off the head of the first King Charles, which is to say, it's been rather a hell of a long time, nearly 4 centuries in fact, since cries of "God save King Charles" were heard in the streets of London. Now, it's been widely assumed for a long time that when he ascends the throne, Charles plans to radically downsize the monarchy and reorganize it along the lines of the other still extant European royal houses: Sweden, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and so on. That he plans on selling off Balmoral and Sandringham, which are private possessions, not owned in right of the crown. But now that Balmoral is the house his mother died in, I wonder if that'll cause a reevaluation of those plans. And you can say the same thing about Sandringham too, I guess, since that's the house where his grandfather and his great-grandfather, Georges V and VI, both breathed their last. I think that would all be a fairly dreadful mistake, personally. Everybody in the world knows who the British monarch is. But how many people outside Norway know the name of the Norwegian king? How many non-Danes can name the Queen of Denmark? With the British Empire nothing but a memory, and with Britain's status as a great power having vanished long ago, if you take away their monarchy, or downsize it, or marginalize it, or make it less publicly prominent, you take away the one thing about your country that is of consistent interest to people in the rest of the world. Decisions like that shouldn't be made flippantly, and especially not out of a misplaced desire to emulate other monarchies that have spent centuries trying and mostly failing to emulate your monarchy. But without the life's work of the woman who was born in 1926 as Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary of York and died yesterday as Queen Elizabeth II, it would be a non-issue. There would be no British monarchy anymore. The Republicans, small r in the British sense of the word, would have succeeded in abolishing the monarchy or neutering it to the point of cultural irrelevance years ago. Now, if you agree, as all reasonable people should agree, that there is value in the ancient and the traditional and the dignified, then you should be a fan of this great woman and the life that she lived. Is it her fault that 3 of her 4 children have had divorces and sex scandals? No, it isn't. She showed them how to live. They couldn't be bothered living up to her example. That is a moral failure on their part, not hers. And I'm glad there seems to be no controversy over the fact that the king's wife is, in fact, the queen consort, which she would be anyway, irrespective of what anybody chooses to call her. Up until 17 years ago, the Prince of Wales, as he was then, he's always cut the figure of an awkward man who wasn't entirely comfortable in his own skin. But when he finally got wed to the only woman he ever really loved, that all seemed to sort of melt away. He became a man who laughs easily and has a healthy capacity for self-deprecation. And without the influence of his second wife, the new queen, I don't think we would see a man today who seems so at ease mingling with his people outside the palace. And I think the new queen has been a great asset, not only to her husband, but to the institution of which he is now the head. Which is quite the journey when you started out as someone who was loathed by the nation as an evil, awful homewrecker. Irrespective of one's views on monarchy, irrespective of whether one gives a damn about anything that happens in Britain. Queen Elizabeth II was an exemplar of how to live a well-lived life. How many people go to their grave with 100% of their dignity intact after nearly a century spent living under the microscope of public scrutiny? Not very many, but she was one. And it's altogether fitting and proper that we should honor her, and I guess we will leave it there. Here's wishing everyone a nice weekend. Rest in peace, Your Majesty. God save the King. See you Monday. Good night.